presento, para los que no lo conocen, a Jeffrey Weeks. Él es profesor emérito de Sociología en la London South Bank University. Es el intelectual británico más significativo en el estudio de la sexualidad a partir de los movimientos radicales de los 70s, autor de varios libros y artículos relacionados con la influencia de la historia, cultura, con la sexualidad, miembro de comités universitarios, editoriales, de prestigiadas revistas científicas. Como profesor ha impartido cursos sobre sociología del género, sexualidad, intimidad y familia, teoría política y social, metodología de investigación, que parte de esto, su liderazgo y contribución al trabajo sociológico a nivel internacional sobre la organización social de la sexualidad, motivó a esta universidad, la South Bank University, para establecer en su honor el Centro Weeks para la Investigación Política y Social en el 2009, donde se realiza investigación de excelencia sobre niñez, juventud y generación, crimen, justicia social y ciudadanía, educación, cultura y comunicación, familias y relaciones, género y sexualidad, raza y etnicidad, religión y creencias, y sustentabilidad, espacio y lugar. Como podrán ver en este centro, aparte de tener un espectro muy amplio para la realización de investigación, pues es precisamente lo que Jeffrey ha venido haciendo sobre la investigación, el explicar muchos aspectos de la sexualidad desde diferentes puntos de vista. Creo que es un honor para nosotros el contar ahora en este 20 aniversario de la FEMESS, en este 10º Congreso, con una personalidad como lo es Jeffrey Weeks. Bienvenido, Jeffrey.
Well, thank you very much. I'm extremely pleased to be here. It's actually 20 years since I first came to Mexico, and I had an amazing time with my partner on that occasion, and I was really pleased to be involved in the discussions on sex education and sexology then. It's therefore a tremendous pleasure to be here for the 20th anniversary of FEMESS and to participate again in the discussions, which have now advanced hugely and are extremely exciting and sophisticated, as indeed they were 20 years ago. But we've all got on and we've all learned from each other, and that is, I think, a tremendous achievement for the sexological and sex education movements. So I'm very honored and privileged to be here. And I would like to thank everyone who made it possible for me to be here and who made this conference possible this week. My topic today is perhaps a controversial one. Many people perhaps feel that the idea of sexual toleration is either patronizing or old-fashioned, or perhaps irrelevant to our current discussions. My argument, in fact, is that we do need the concept of sexual toleration, but to see why we need to use it, we need to look at its history. And that's one of the major things I want to do today. I want to look at the history of the concept of sexual tolerance and to look at its critics. So could I have slide 1, please? Right. Now here are 3 books which talk about the concept of toleration and in fact critique it, and I'll come to them in a moment. So sexual toleration, or sexual tolerance rather, the idea that we can live together in diversity and difference sounds such a good idea that surely no one can be against it. Yet the idea of sexual toleration has been highly challenged and contested. It breeds suspicion, and suspicions have as often fallen on self-declared liberals as on outright conservatives or reactionaries. Perhaps because the liberal tradition embodies precisely all the contradictions of the concept of toleration. And these three books try to explore those contradictions to some degree. So could we have slide 2, please? In his pioneering exploration of the early gay liberation movement in the early 1970s, Dennis Altman, in Homosexual Oppression and Liberation, commented that the most common form of oppression for gays is neither outright persecution nor overt discrimination, but the patronizing tolerance of liberals, what the novelist Christopher Isherwood called annihilation by blandness. This was very much the prevailing view among sex radicals of the time, which I'll come on to in a few minutes. And it has persisted, written into broader critiques of the concept. So the American philosopher Wendy Brown, whose book I had up there, has argued that the idea of tolerance can hide the historical and power sources of difference, displace ideas of justice and equality, reduces differences to individual experiences, and points to an agenda of individual emotional and behavioral change rather than political and social transformation. This is what the writer Susanna Walters, whose book was also up there, calls the tolerance trap, where apparent changes in attitudes and public practices in relationship to homosexuality in a number of Western countries, and especially the USA, obscures deeper realities of continuing inequality hidden under the warm blanket of toleration. Now, these arguments point to a fundamental problem with the concept of tolerance. It is frequently a stance, a position based on anxiety rather than full acceptance, on acquiescence rather than commitment. For millions across the globe, still subject to various forms of sexual oppression and exploitation, tolerance might seem a glorious gift. Better the tolerance that lowers people, that demeans people, than the absolutism that denies or kills them. The problem is that tolerance is always subject to the arbitrary permission of authority and the fickle waves of public opinion, and stops full short of full recognition of the validity of different ways of life. Tolerance, Walters argues, allows bigotry to stay in place and shores up irrational hatred, even as it attempts to corral it. It may be that this is the best we can expect in a complex world of diversity and incompatible values, but it underlines why the idea has to be handled with caution. So slide 3, please, next slide. The ambiguity in the concept of tolerance is deeply rooted in a particular history, and particularly the history of European religious conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries, and reflects the uneasy and hard-won accommodation between different Christian sects which might otherwise be murdering each other. It usually reflected a reluctant acceptance by the majority or strongest groups that they could not completely defeat the faiths of others, but had to find a way of living with them as best they could. The result was messy and often contradictory, taking different forms in different countries. In the USA, religious tolerance granted freedom for individual conscience, but frequently gave rise to intolerant religious groups, a tradition which still actively survives. In the Netherlands, the so-called pillarization of society, with different religious groups granted equal but separate rights over their congregations, helped to shape the philosophy of apartheid in South Africa, based on racial segregation and separate development. So tolerance did not, in this history, indicate approval. On the contrary, it usually signaled mutual disapproval. It assumed incompatibility between different faiths and the dangers of difference and division. It was a pragmatic response by those in power to the murderous consequences of pursuing separate truths at all costs. So tolerance in this interpretation is not a good in itself, but a means to other ends, living together without approval or full acceptance. It is easy to see how this readily slides into the patronizing tolerance of sexual others that critics have talked about. Slide 4, please. The next slide. Okay. The cultural and political wars around sexuality and gender of the 21st century may seem less murderous than the religious fanaticism of the 16th and 17th century. But it has not, of course, stopped adulterous women or gays being hanged, stoned, or punished, or pushed to their deaths because of their sexualities in the service of contemporary fundamentalisms. And countless millions have suffered the personal impact of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. The dilemmas of sexual conflicts are in many ways similar to the dilemmas of religious conflicts, of how to find ways of living together in a diverse and ever more complicated world, where sex has become the truth of our being and where personal choices and characteristics have potentially profound political and public implications. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British sexologist Havelock Ellis forecast that the old battlegrounds of religion and class were being replaced by the new ones of sex. After a century of tumultuous change, we can now see that he partially misread the signs. What makes our present so complex and challenging is that it brings together both religion, class, nationalism, race, sexuality, and gender into a potent and combustible mix at the heart of a global battlefield. Not the least of the paradoxes of the concept is that despite or maybe because of this tortured history, even the most fervent critics of toleration have found it very difficult to reject the idea completely. In other words, in a complex world, can we actually live without some notion of toleration? It is how to reconcile hitherto tabooed or hated practices with dominant norms, with homosexuality, the classic example, that gives rise to demands for tolerance, reflecting the persistence of naturalistic or essentialist assumptions about what is normal and abnormal. So even the major critics of the idea of tolerance that I started with, including Susanna Walters and Wendy Brown, in the end come round to accepting that some idea of tolerance is actually still necessary. And I'll come on to talk in more details later about what this means. But essentially, it's about combining the idea of tolerance with ideas of social justice, equality, and mutuality. And more particularly, a German writer on toleration, Rainer Forst, makes a key distinction, which I'm going to use, between ideas of tolerance based on permission, that is, some superior power telling people to tolerate others, involving a limited acceptance because there is no alternative, and those based on respect, based on mutual recognition, which is the position that I'm going to argue for. But what these debates illustrates is the fact that toleration is an elusive and promiscuous concept, much more so than it is often presented. So in the rest of this paper, I want to explore the hazards and possibilities of the idea by exploring key moments in its history. First, I explore its role in the development of liberal attitudes from the 19th century to the present, to clarify the relationship between theories of personal freedom, the approaches of early sexologists, and the so-called revolution, and the development of the first tentative reforms. Secondly, I want to look at the relationship between tolerance and the so-called sexual revolution of the past generation, to show how the hopes for human emancipation were tempered by the more complex realities of late modern life. Third, I will discuss its role in controversies concerning the globalization of sexuality, where Western ideals of tolerance have become identified with American imperialism, and yet new discourses of human sexual rights have emerged at the same time and have become the main vehicle for sexual and gender justice. Finally, I will explore the possibilities of recovering the concept in the light of what the sociologist Ken Plummer calls cosmopolitan sexualities and the everyday life experiments that characterize late modern sexualities. My purpose is not to resolve magically the contradictions of tolerance, but to suggest that these contradictions offer a marker, a sign of our current dilemmas and perplexities. So first, I want to look at the liberal dilemma. All societies have to live with the fact of sexual and gender diversity and have dealt with it in a variety of ways, from harsh enforcement of moral conformity to institutionalized regimes of difference. Historically, Western societies have lived with upper-class adultery, casual promiscuity, widespread prostitution, a double standard of morality for men and women, a great range of non-reproductive practices, and widespread same-sex activity, despite the existence of usually religious-based dominant systems that argue for sexual restraint, fidelity, and compulsory heterosexuality. The existence of subcultures of male homosexuality in European cities from at least the 15th century, despite death penalties for sodomy, testifies to one form of accommodation. The widespread existence of patterns of institutionalized cross-gender practices or of intergenerational puberty rights across a variety of different cultures similarly testifies to other ways of combining or embracing a degree of gender and sexual fluidity. In none of these examples, however, is there any generalized acceptance of plural ways of life or competing personal goals. Puberty rights embracing same-sex practices are precisely gateways to accepted notions of adulthood and existing gender patterns. Cross-gender practices similarly confirm existing gender patterns in various other cultures. Where individuals tried to live outside the norms entirely, they were labeled as heretics, sinners, or outlaws, precisely living beyond the law, beyond morality, and beyond social recognition. What I'm suggesting is ideas of sexual tolerance only become possible or necessary as societies, and Western societies in particular, become more complex and plural under the impact of urbanization, industrialization, and huge population growth. And new concepts of gender and sexualized identities began to emerge. From the 18th century, what has been described as the first sexual revolution gave rise to the idea of individual sexual freedom, though this was heavily tempered by gendered and classed assumptions. From the second half of the 19th century, especially in the English-speaking countries, we see the elaboration of liberal ideas of individual autonomy, feeding into new, would-be scientific notions of sexual diversity. It is in this moment that we can see the gradual, often painfully slow emergence of the idea of sexual toleration, going beyond the traditional patriarchal turning a blind eye to social evils such as prostitution or homosexuality, and beginning to realize that different identities coexist, different sexual identities coexist in the same cultures. The next slide, please. Here I show books on sexual toleration, on liberty, involving discussions of toleration by John Stuart Mill, the great British liberal philosopher of the mid-19th century. I want to say a few words about Mill because he provides a key example of the possibilities, tensions, and limitations of liberal thought on toleration then and now. Although his work was heavily concerned with the subjection of women, and he was a strong supporter of contemporary feminism, he was not especially concerned with sexual issues, and he does not directly theorize sexual toleration. But his essay on liberty, illustrated there, was to have a profound influence on sex reformers up to the present day in liberal thinking. The concept of toleration outlined by Mill is based on respect for the individual and his or her diverse ends. The only concept of freedom worthy of the name, he argued, was that of pursuing our own good in our own way, as long as we do not try to deprive others of their own freedom. The only justification for interference with individual actions, he argued, was to prevent harm to others. Laws and religious interferences were obviously hostile to this notion of freedom. But in England, Mill believed, a greater enemy than law and religious interference was what he called the tyranny of the majority, a social tyranny, more formidable than many kinds of political oppression, since it leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself. In other words, central to the liberal argument was the idea that the tyranny of prejudice of the majority against minorities was more dangerous than legal restraints. So finding the limit of legitimate interference of collective opinion and custom on individual independence is, Mill argues, as indispensable to the human good as protection against political despotism. This is the domain, the territory of tolerance. Now, the appeal of such a philosophy to sexual reformers, it should be obvious, and I'll explore an example of its impact in a moment. But first of all, I want to highlight two significant limitations of this liberalism. The first is the specific exclusion by Mill of the applicability of his philosophy of liberty to what he calls primitive people. The implication is that they are not yet ready for freedom, and that colonial governments are therefore justified in imposing rules of conduct on them. His intentions were probably paternalistic rather than exploitative, but are nevertheless fully in line with the long history of European colonial encounters with the mysterious others in the rest of the world since the 16th century. And also with the increased imperialist ventures at the end of the 19th century, in which the regulation and control and reordering of colonial sexualities was central. Here we can see one of the roots of the suspicion of Western liberalism, which is a feature of many post-colonial critiques of the idea of Western toleration. Secondly, the harm principle that he talks about, that anything is permitted as long as it doesn't harm other people, has its own problems as applied to sexuality. Mill is clear that the only justification for exercising power over others in a civilized community is to prevent harm to others. The implication of this is that homosexuality, for example, should not be condemned as an individual wrong as long as it does not harm others. Nor should it be condemned if a majority are against it. But that leaves open the question of whether the very existence of open homosexuality can do harm to a community as a moral corruption, which is what many have argued over the last 100 years, or that it can cause psychological problems by encouraging certain forms of behavior. Such questions mattered because many of the prejudices of the 19th century soon became written into so-called scientific and medical definitions of the issues, claiming the authority of science. The next slide, please. Now, here are two examples of pioneering sexologists who advocated greater tolerance in relationship to sexuality. The top one is the English sexologist Havelock Ellis, and the one down below is the German sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld. Barely half a century after Mill wrote the essay on toleration, the pioneering sexologists began to offer a different but complementary approach. There were a variety of different approaches, different theoretical approaches, and no necessary agreement on ends. But broadly, the most influential sexologists attempted two things: to put the understanding of sexual diversity on a scientific basis, and to support sex reforms that were compatible with what they understood as a true understanding of the sexual instinct. An approach summed up in Magnus Hirschfeld's famous motto, "Through science to justice." Through science to justice. And that became the main justification for sexology from the beginning of the 20th century. Now, many critics since then, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, have seen sexology itself as a shaper of a new truth regime, as a key moment in a shift towards new forms of regulation and control over bodies. Medicine and psychiatry began to displace religion as embodiments of truth, while new sexological typologies and descriptions from the homosexual, invert, third sexer, to the transvestite, the sadomasochist, the bisexual, the transvestite, the voyeurist, and so on, all inventions of the end of the 19th century, provided the basis for new identities and for new modes of control and regulation. Now, this is important, but it is also crucial to recognize why sexology appealed to sexual liberals and to the new voices that began to speak of their own sexualities in the 20th century. The suggestion that sexual diversities were natural variations, part of a spectrum of sexualities, offered a path to justifying tolerance on apparently rational scientific grounds. In other words, the very fact of diversity was itself an argument for tolerance. Now, at first, no one argued that this should mean that all sexualities that didn't harm others were equally acceptable. Sexology at first continued to live with ideas of the natural priority of heterosexuality, the importance of reproduction, the problematic nature of the perversions, and the existence of a sexual hierarchy, which embodied this. And many were keen to explore treatment and even cures for sexual deviations, which inevitably assumed their inferiority. What it did do, however, was to fit within what I earlier called a permission model of toleration. In other words, there was a form of toleration based on the idea that there was a natural hierarchy, but within that one could begin to accept inferior but living forms of sexuality. The next slide, please. Now, this is a picture of one of the most famous examples of arguments about toleration in the 1950s in England and Wales and Scotland mainly, but had an influence much more widely. The Wolfenden Report. By the 1950s, many reformers were beginning to argue that it was important that homosexuality was not treated as a criminal offense, but should be treated more like a sickness or an illness, or as a condition that might be unfortunate but couldn't be helped. Liberal reformers argued that the harm done by an action must be balanced by the harm done by making it illegal. So if a law, as the law on homosexuality, was unworkable, that is to say, it didn't stop homosexuality, then it should be liberalized as a marker of a necessary tolerance. This proved to be a remarkably influential position that shaped a whole host of reforming legislation in England and Wales on homosexuality, abortion, divorce, obscenity, and censorship, and so on in the years ahead. With global echoes, this Wolfenden Report had influence throughout the English-speaking world, for instance, and beyond that. But what these reforms that resulted from this failed to do was to make any moral stance on the merits of the sexual activities themselves. So in the Wolfenden Report, there is no endorsement of homosexuality. It is an unfortunate condition. But equally, they suggested it was not the duty of the law to interfere in private activities, however much society might disapprove of it. The task of the law was to maintain public order. Hence, the immediate effect of the report was a tightening of the law against public displays of prostitution. And when male homosexuality was belatedly decriminalized between consenting adults in private 10 years later, it was accompanied by a tripling of prosecutions for homosexual offenses in public. In other words, decriminalizing private activity didn't necessarily mean that you tolerated it at a social level. In fact, penalties could increase at the same time for public activity, public displays of homosexuality, as private actions could be decriminalized. So this was reform as a mode of regulation, tolerance as a concession to an unchanging sexual hierarchy. But this isn't all that can be said. The campaigns to change the law in Britain were part of a wider emergence in the 1950s and 1960s of organisations arguing for change in attitudes to homosexuality. Each worked within a different tradition and characteristic of their own culture. In the USA, for instance, the Mattachine Society argued for the rights of a sexual minority that fitted easily into America's discourse of civil rights. Or perhaps not so easily, but logically. In France, on the contrary, the French equivalent of the Mattachine, Acadie, advocated assimilation into French society, which paralleled the disapproval of minority identities and the universalism of French culture. In Britain, there was a cautious embrace of a modest and pragmatic utilitarianism. What mattered was what worked rather than principles. So what all these were doing, building on their own cultures, was appealing for a limited toleration within a dominant and at this point unchallenged sexual order. But at the same time as this was happening, something more challenging was occurring. The subjects of these various reforming efforts began to act as if they had full freedoms that law and custom had historically denied them. We see, in other words, the emergence of new forms of sexual agency based on the rejection of oppressive and discriminatory laws and customs of the past, and the beginnings of new movements for which tolerance was an inadequate ideal. And this brings me on to my next theme, which is tolerance and the sexual revolution. Could I have the next slide, please? What I want to illustrate in this slide is the idea of Herbert Marcuse, who was very influential for a time in the 1960s, as a prophet of the sexual revolution, his rejection of what he called repressive tolerance, which he argued serves the cause of oppression. It bound people to the status quo by giving them an illusion of freedom, whilst trapping them in consumerism, sexual repression, and exploitation. Sexuality has been subordinated to the interests of capital. So what was required, he argued, was intolerance. Intolerance of prevailing policies, attitudes, opinions, and tolerance, not of the status quo, but of subversive or repressed or suppressed opinions and attitudes, in order to recover a liberating practice. Now, Marcuse's influence was limited to a particular period, and he was soon critiqued for his essentialism and utopianism. But you could see his influence in the sort of arguments I started with. I mean, particularly in Dennis Altman's critique of liberal tolerance. Both early second-wave feminism and gay liberation identified as part of a wider movement for social transformation, where gender and sexual change would be part of wider radical changes in social relationships. There seemed to be little room for the gradualism of sexual liberalism and cautious tolerance, and much of the energy of the new sexual militants was directed against the timidity of their immediate predecessors. But in practice, in the messy world of real life, rather than the clear works of theorists, things turned out to be more complex and ambivalent. The 1960s have traditionally been seen as the decade of sexual revolution, at least in the global north. But I prefer to see that decade as a moment in a long, complex, increasingly globalized and unfinished transition whose effects are still working their way through societies at different paces, different generational experiences, with often contradictory effects. And in this emergence, sexuality soon became a divisive factor within society and even within, for example, the women's movement itself. Displaying, in fact, in these new social movements, a lack of mutual toleration itself. Next slide, please. And what's interesting is that by the 1980s and 1990s, we see the emergence in various parts of the world of the idea of zero tolerance as a radical activity. And I give 3 examples there. Debates over the veil of Muslim women, debates over prostitution, and debates over paedophilia, intergenerational sex between adults and children. The first is the banning of the wearing of the veil by Muslim women in France and neighboring countries, in line with a universalistic refusal, especially in a country like France, to recognize differentiated activities and identities within a secular state. A whole range of different issues are at stake here: fear over separatist multiculturalism, elements of Islamophobia, the limits of absolute choice in how one should dress, deeply embedded traditions, cultural alienation, patriarchal attitudes, sexual modesty, religious freedom, and the meanings of individual autonomy in plural societies. The conflicts over such views are complex and not easily resolved. But there's no doubt, unfortunately to my mind, that large majorities in would-be liberal countries like France, Belgium, and Switzerland endorse zero tolerance of the veil. Here, it seems to me, is a classic example of John Stuart Mill's tyranny of the majority in operation. The second area I want to use as an example is the so-called Swedish model of regulating prostitution by making the use of prostitutes by men illegal. Traditionally, Western societies on the whole, and those influenced by them, have usually regulated prostitution by tacitly accepting its inevitability amongst men through an ideology of male sexual needs and punishing or managing the women. The new approach, the Swedish model, rejects this in favor of an approach that instead punishes the users, with the ultimate aim of abolishing prostitution by abolishing the demand for it. On the surface, at least, this appears a progressive move by removing regulation from women and moving it on to men. But many critics have pointed to the increased risk to sex workers in this situation as prostitution is pushed underground, and the dangers of replacing the criminalization of one group of women, one group of people, i.e. women, in favor of criminalizing large numbers of men, creating a new caste of perverts who should not be tolerated. The third area is probably the most controversial of all, the question of intergenerational sex or paedophilia. The early gay movement in the 1970s provided a model for the emergence of paedophile organizations, claiming voice, rights, social recognition, and tolerance. The leading gay organizations, however, soon distanced themselves from the paedophile movements, which were never large or particularly influential, and in fact proved disastrous for their supporters. And the International Gay and Lesbian Association, ILGA, made a decisive break in the 1980s to maintain its credibility. But this did not stop an ever-increasing moral panic about child sex abuse, which has become a central issue in contemporary debates on sexuality. The feminist emphasis on power in relationship to sexuality highlighted the inherent inequalities of adult-child relations, and a number of horrific cases of abuse of children dramatized both its long and hidden history and the casualness with which society had accepted exploitation of children in the past, especially in the era of sexual liberation. Now, this seems to offer an inarguable case for zero tolerance. The difficulty was that the generalized sense of anxiety about adult-child relations in the modern era has been heightened and even exaggerated by the panic over paedophilia, making any rational and dispassionate discussion and response to the issues of child abuse and child safety virtually impossible. What I'm trying to suggest is that in various cases, zero tolerance exemplifies the paradox of tolerance, that at the limit of what can be accepted, intolerance may be called on in order to achieve a tolerant society. And that's the dilemma. Can we achieve a tolerant society by being intolerant? The rise of zero tolerance was a product of a regime of sexuality where liberal tolerance seemed to be growing, but so were the conflicts and contradictions of sexual relations. Slide 10, the next slide, please. The sex radicals of the 1970s and 80s assumed that radical change in attitudes towards sexuality would necessitate wider social transformation. But the reality turned out to be quite different. The great transition I talked about had its own dynamic, and even during the social and cultural backlash of the AIDS panic in the 1980s, and even during that period, under the surface of events, dramatic changes were taking place in everyday life, propelled by the breakdown of tradition, individualizing processes, and wider social, economic, and cultural change. With different timeframes and in different ways, with many hesitations, often sustained by violent religious and cultural backlashes, many Western societies liberalized their laws and began to support new cultures of tolerance towards sexual minorities, with attitudes towards homosexuality changing most dramatically. In many ways, the LGBT movement from the 1970s, taking different paces and different natures in different countries, was the most successful of all the new social movements of the period in achieving many of the goals, even if the way they did this was quite different from what was hoped for or dreamt of in the 1970s. A classic example of this is the preoccupation with same-sex marriage. In the 1970s, most of the new activists were deeply opposed to same-sex marriage. In fact, not even opposed, didn't even think it necessary or possible. And they adopted feminist critiques of marriage. From the late 80s, however, this has gradually and now increasingly changed under the impact both of the AIDS crisis and of the rise of many family situations and lesbian and gay parenting. So we see in recent times the increasing move towards same-sex marriage being a focus for the LGBT movement. However, many critics have argued that the emphasis on same-sex marriage meant a loss of radical energy and vision from the social movements that had pushed for radical change. Susanna Walters, who I mentioned earlier, wondered how a walk down the aisle had replaced a walk on the wild side. She suggested that the effects of the gay rights agenda in the USA had been to reinforce differences between homosexuality and heterosexuality, especially through the continued biologization of homosexuality. The idea of a fluid sexuality, which had been at the heart of radical attitudes in the 1970s, had been lost in the passionate adherence of gay rights advocates to the idea that homosexuality was a genetic quality of a fixed minority. Precisely the arguments of the early pioneers of sexology. In homosexuality becoming ordinary, everyday, rather than transgressive, questions about the intersection of other dimensions of inequality, ethnic and racial, national, economic and social, with sexual difference has been lost. What we had instead was what Lisa Duggan described as homonormativity. For such critics, a new regime of tolerance has triumphed, but at the expense of wider questions of equality and social justice. This perspective had resonance because of the ways in which the question of tolerance became enmeshed in wider issues concerning globalization and the conflicts between the West and the global South over sexual issues. Could I have the next slide, please? What I want to do in this section is just look at the various arguments that have been put forward over the way tolerance works in a globalizing world. Tolerance, Wendy Brown has written, has become a token of Western legitimacy in international affairs and a justification for Western empire with sexuality to the fore. Such critiques have had weight because there was a transparent history which I've mentioned. John Stuart Mill's casual assumption that liberty and toleration were not appropriate for primitive peoples echoes through all the discussions about the contacts between the West and the global South since the time of the conquistadors in the 16th century and reached a new intensity in the imperial dominance of the late 19th century. Britain's imposition of anti-homosexual legislation on all its colonies continues to have an effect in the contemporary world. The majority of states that still criminalize homosexuality today are members of the Commonwealth, that is, former members of the British Empire. Western imperial powers imposed their notions of morality and social order on the colonized peoples, legitimized by sexual and gender ideologies that have continued to shape modern belief systems into the present. So, for example, historians have noted the ways in which 19th century stereotypes of Islamic and Arab sexualities as corrupt, cruel, effeminate, and homosexual have helped feed into Islamophobic belief systems and policies towards contemporary Islam today. Images of Africa as naturally heterosexual, with homosexuality alien to the continent, have been taken up by post-colonial regimes, with sometimes devastating effects in the age of AIDS. So, for example, the former South African President Thabo Mbeki's refusal to accept the HIV causation of AIDS seems to have been fueled by suspicion of Western intervention on sexual issues that was deeply rooted in anti-colonial struggles. Given this history, recent interventions by Western leaders affirming Western values of modernity and tolerance in response to anti-homosexual activities in Islamic regimes and in Africa and Eastern Europe can all too readily be seen as hypocritical, given the histories of their own countries until very recently. And at worst seem simply a reenactment of old colonial practices of attempting to reshape the sexualities of colonized people. So the intervention in 2011 by the British Prime Minister David Cameron and the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, proposing what was called conditionality in the distribution of Western aid to homophobic regimes, took for granted the moral superiority of the West. And as a result, many LGBT advocates of human sexual rights have been accused of complicity in this discourse. So, for example, the writer Jasby Pure has denounced what she describes as homo-nationalism, by which American, European and Israeli promotion of homosexual rights have been represented as support of perpetual war against Islam. The Gay International, as Joseph Massad has polemicized in his book called Desiring Arabs, is guilty of attempting to impose an American-style gay identity on the complex sexual ecology of the Arab Islamic world, and in the process attempting to reorder individual lives and provoking a backlash against same-sex practices in these countries. In such arguments, tolerance is seen not as a goal to work for, but as an imposition of Western empire in a new guise. It is, of course, perfectly justified to critique crude identitarian enthusiasms that assume that one Western view of what constitutes gay identity should become the global norm. The revolution in sexual theory since the 1970s has emphasized that there is no such thing as a universal gay identity, and a claim to rights based on assumed universal characteristics is indeed misleading and culturally distorting. But two further points can justifiably be made. In the first place, it is equally historically inaccurate to believe that the work of the Gay International creates or even stimulates injustice and intolerance in countries of the global south. There is plentiful evidence that the anti-colonial and post-colonial regimes in Africa and elsewhere developed an anti-homosexual and otherwise sexually conservative stance in the pre-independence movements and long before there was such a thing as a Gay International. Homophobia has indeed been strengthened by outsiders, but not by the Gay International, but largely by American Christian evangelical preachers working in countries such as Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda. Could I have the next slide, please? But the second point to make is a more positive one, is that whatever the inadequacies, as argued by people like Massad, of universal rights as an idea, it has become the main vehicle for transnational campaigns for sexual justice in a wide range of areas, from reproductive rights to the needs of people living with HIV and AIDS. And here we see an example of the emergence of the recent Declaration of Sexual Rights, which colleagues in the room have been involved in, by the World Association for Sexual Health, which builds on 2 decades of campaigning that affirms that sexual rights are grounded in universal human rights that are already recognized in international and regional human rights documents, in national constitutions and laws, in human rights standards and principles, and in scientific knowledge related to human sexuality and sexual health. It reaffirms that sexuality is at the core of what it is to be human. In practice, the language used such as the common use of the word gay, hides a growing recognition that words and concepts mean different things in different cultures, signifying that what unifies people is not a common and changing identity, but different ways of being sexual and being human that equally demand recognition and justice. So to conclude my talk, I want to look at the idea of cosmopolitanism, of tolerance and cosmopolitanism in relationship to different life experiences. So could I have the next slide, please? For Wendy Brown, tolerance is a political discourse that inferiorizes and debases. Almost all objects of tolerance are marked as deviant, marginal, or undesirable by virtue of being tolerated. Tolerance reduces political and structural factors to individual, even genetic problems and prejudices, and depoliticizes them. This is the core of Susanna Walter's rejection of toleration. It individualizes difficulties and obscures them. It is not a stepping to freedom, but stands in the way. Yet, as I've argued, even these severe critics of tolerance can't quite find it in themselves to reject tolerance completely. Brown says in a dialogue with Rainer Forst that the work she has done is not against tolerance, but offers a critique of contemporary tolerance discourse. The problem is that both she and Walters do little to describe an alternative discourse. To my mind, an equally modest proposal is that we should begin by separating the concept of tolerance from its association with the strengths and weaknesses of American foreign policy. The distinction that Forst makes between a permission concept of tolerance and a respect concept offers a useful start. The first, that is the permission concept, is concessionary and conditional. The second is about mutuality and recognition and a positive understanding of what tolerance can be. The next slide, please. Here are some quotes about tolerance. Susan Mendes argues that tolerance requires making opportunities for others and going out of one's way to assist them. John Stuart Mill long ago said that diversity is not an evil, but a good. And as such, it should be nurtured and fostered. But that has to involve simultaneous understanding of the power and structures, economic, social, cultural, racial, that inhibit the full acceptance of diversity. A dialogue across difference is difficult when only one side favors talking. In this context, an ideal of mutual tolerance is not a soft option, it is at the heart of global conflicts. But as Zygmunt Bauman says, quoted there, tolerance as such is possible only in the form of solidarity. That is a practical recognition of the relevance and validity of the other's difference, expressed in a willing engagement in the dialogue. And that final quote from Ken Plummer, global human values, empathy and dialogue, care and kindness, dignity and rights, actualization and human flourishing, and fairness and justice are keys to what he sees as cosmopolitanism. His version of cosmopolitanism is based on a critical humanism that takes seriously these issues. This is not so much a work of realization of something that already exists, but of construction, of making sure that in all our engagements in the world, we're actually creating these values that justify our belief in human agency, human equality, and social justice. It's about recognizing that people can and do live together in difference and diversity. So could I have slide 50, the next slide? It is useful, Mill suggests, that there should be different opinions and there should be different experiments in living. Different experiments in living. Over a century later, the sociologist Anthony Giddens similarly spoke of the everyday experiments in living that late modernity forced onto millions of people as unprecedented change and the flows of globalization fundamentally undermined traditional ways of life. These provide the spaces for what Plummer calls the grounded everyday utopias that are making for a new sexual world. Faced by the murderous intensities of the fundamentalist and absolute enemies of tolerance, these may seem fragile aspirations. Given how far we have come in many parts of the world from the discourses of hate and fear that once surrounded diversity and difference, I see in these life experiments going on all over the world resources for hope that we can indeed resist the power of hate and fear, and learn to live together in a spirit of respect and mutual tolerance. Thank you very much.
Hemos oído una espléndida conferencia, una reflexión a esto que es la tolerancia, y tenemos tiempo precisamente para comentarios, preguntas, aclaraciones, que aprovechen la oportunidad que tenemos a Jeffrey Wicks aquí, un gran amigo para la FEMESS y para muchos de los sexólogos. ¿Alguien tiene algún comentario o pregunta?
Sí, muy buenas tardes. Yo quisiera preguntarle si este peligro, riesgo que pues creo que sí estamos viendo de lo que llama la homonormatividad, únicamente o es más latente ese riesgo entre hombres heterosexuales, entre hombres homosexuales, o también aplicaría en mujeres lesbianas.
The argument about, sorry, I'm hearing myself double. The argument about homonormativity is that as a result of changes in the United States over the last 20 or 30 years, lesbians and gays and the two are associated have become in effect equivalent to an ethnic minority who are more concerned with the idea that they were born this way than that that society as a whole needs change. I put it crudely, but that's basically the argument. I think the situation is infinitely more complex than that, and I don't personally believe that changes like same-sex marriage, equality under the law, and other major changes that have taken place in many countries are any example of a surrender to the dominant regime. I think the very fact of social change, of increased legal tolerance, for instance, or the existence of same-sex marriage, changes the nature of these facts. So I think even if the arguments are often conservatively addressed, the implications can be radical. However, I know that Lisa Duggan and others' argument about normativity have been enormously influential, both in the United States and elsewhere. And they do reflect an anxiety that some of the radical energy of the early movements has disappeared. I just add one point to that. The radical energies of the early movements in the 1970s in North America and parts of Western Europe was the radical energy of a tiny minority. The campaigns to change the law and for same-sex marriage are actually campaigns that involve hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people. And therefore, what's the most radical? The radicalism of a small minority, or the cautious liberalism which achieves change of a large mass of people? I pose that as a challenge, but it's a real issue, I think, when we think about sexual change.
Bueno, pues antes que nada felicitarlo. Me gustó mucho su ponencia de la tolerancia. Para nosotras en México, como compañeras de trabajadoras sexuales, nos parece que la palabra tolerancia es que hueles a caca, pero te tolero, ¿no? Y esa parte que dijiste tú de que viene como una imposición del imperialismo, eso también lo hemos visto en los países suecos, que están atacando a las compañeras trabajadoras sexuales, que dicen que no las castigan a ellas, pero castigan al cliente, lo cual están castigando a las compañeras, que eso mismo están haciendo las abolicionistas en México, aquí para atacar a las compañeras trabajadoras sexuales. Esta parte, escúchenlo bien, porque son políticas que están haciendo en todo México. Pues muchas gracias. Nada más compartir con usted que estoy de acuerdo y que pues el modelo sueco realmente, ¿cuántos habitantes son? Y que no ha traído ningún beneficio para nada. O la tolerancia cero que mandó Giuliani, que tampoco ha funcionado, ¿no? Gracias.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. The argument seems simple on the surface that you know, instead of punishing the women, you punish the man. But actually, in practice, it leads to all sorts of other contradictions, which don't in any way contribute to the abolition of prostitution, but actually impact ultimately on the women themselves, on the sex workers themselves.
¿Alguien más? ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Bien, si no hay algún otro comentario o pregunta, le hacemos entrega de este obsequio de un libro sobre Nuevo León que nos hace el favor con arte de ofrecerlo en el gobierno de Nuevo León, y les pido un gran aplauso para el amigo Jeffrey Wicks.
Está la mañana en que vengo a saludarte. Venimos todos con gusto y placer a felicitarte. El día en que tú naciste, nacieron todas las flores. En la pila del bautizo cantaron los ruiseñores. Ya viene amaneciendo